Welcome back. In the previous lesson, we untangled some confusions about whether free will and moral responsibility are just the same thing. They're not. Now we need to clear up some confusions about the relation between determinism and fatalism. To get to that issue, begin with a metaethical principle that's discussed by Kwame Anthony Appiah in section 9.11, the principle ought implies can. First, what's a metaethical principle? The distinction between ethics and metaethics is like the distinction between a recipe and the rules of a test kitchen. Moral and ethical principles tell you what to do or what you ought to do, just as a recipe tells you what to do. For example, one frequently debated ethical principle or norm is the utilitarian principle that says the right thing to do in any circumstance is whatever creates the greatest good for the greatest number of people in the long run. Normative ethical debates involve, for example, the question of whether we ought to behave in the way that this utilitarian principle tells us to act. Metaethical principles provide constraints on ethical principles. In the same way, there might be overarching rules of cooking that constrain recipes. Maybe some candidates are never cook with a wine you wouldn't drink or use enough fat. These could be meta-recipe principles. Now that we have a general idea of what a metaethical principle is meant to do, let's look at ought implies can. The idea of ought implies can is that you can't be morally required to do something that's impossible to do. So, if you ought to do it, then it must be something you can do. Ought implies can. Ethicists don't unanimously agree to this principle, of course. Some think that you can be morally required to do something that you can't do, that it could be instructive to aim for a target you can't hit. But more debate concerns the nature of the possibility at stake. I can't help impoverished people in Kenya while I attend a concert in New York. But does that mean that I can prevent myself from having moral obligations to people in Kenya by continuously going to concerts in New York? Probably not. In the case of free will, a common concern is that determinism has the consequence that we can't be morally responsible for any actions that are caused. The alleged problem arises by way of the principle of alternative possibilities. The principle of alternate possibilities says you can only be morally responsible for something if you could have done otherwise. I should not be blamed for something if I couldn't have done otherwise. Put another way, if I ought to have done something else, then it must be possible that I could have done something else. There must be alternative possibilities. So, as you can see, the principle of alternate possibilities can be understood as being implied by the principle that ought implies can. Now, if determinism is true, then whatever I'm doing is what was always going to happen, fully determined from the start of the universe. That seems, to many people, to imply that there's no alternative possibility after all. And if there's no alternate possibility, if I couldn't have done otherwise, then I can't be morally responsible for whatever it is that I'm doing. Some people go so far as to equate having free will with the possibility of alternative action. If so, then if I could not have done otherwise, then I have no free will. Fortunately, or at least fortunately for those of us who think the world is deterministic and we nevertheless have free will, the line of reasoning that connects determinism to the denial of free will by way of the principle of alternative possibility is unsound. This is the topic for our next lesson.